Well, thank you again for joining us. My name is Connor Hepp, and I am the president of your Chester County History Center. After this past year, I cannot tell you how happy I am to see so many people in the History Center and to see all of your smiling faces. It's lovely. So thanks to the community members and supporters like you, we have been able to preserve, share, celebrate the remarkable history of our county, our nation, and our community. Throughout these walls, in our library, and through our archives and exhibitions, you will find stories. Stories of bravery and fear, stories of perseverance and redemption, stories of success and failure. In our new core exhibition, you will learn the story of an African-American soldier who was a hero of both the Battle of the Brandywine and of the American Revolution. In our library and archives can be found documents that tell the story of an African-American man who was a leader in one of our national civil rights movements. And on our walls, you will see an amazing photographic exhibition that shares the stories and celebrates the lives of African-American women in our community. Tonight, during our county's Juneteenth festival, I'm excited to be able to help kick off our town tours. I welcome and invite each of you to come back and experience your Chester County History Center. As I turn over the podium over to a friend and board member, Todd Pride, I would like to thank the Chester County Planning Commission, the Chester County Commissioners, and Voices Underground, and all of the organizations across our amazing county that have played a part in this Juneteenth festival and celebration. Thank you.
Brian, thank you, and welcome to everybody here. And Brian, when you asked me to speak here, I think I'm a relatively new board member of the Chester County History Center. I don't think you know that I used to work for a Baptist minister. And so when I have the opportunity to speak, but I'm going to stay within the time frame that we have. So the other element from when you had asked me to speak here, I think you know I do speak quite a bit in public, and whether or not that's as a fishing trainer, hunting heritage trainer, land conservation leader in the work that I do professionally with the new conservation organization, I oftentimes don't write what I have to talk about, but I felt that this was such an important day and an important time that I wanted to put pen to paper, write it down, follow what I'm writing, some from the heart, but this is an important day for me, as you'll hear in just a second, but also want to thank our partners, all the partners that came together for this that you're going to hear from today. I want to thank our partners and lead partners at Voices Underground and the Square Roots Collective for putting the level of energy behind this, and this wonderful history center that I'm hoping that if you're not a member, that you will become a member. If not today, then over these next few weeks, and seeing the kind of things that this wonderful institution has. And so with my my comments, I think we all know with Juneteenth, in this turbulent wake of George Floyd, we have elevated the importance of our racial issues in this country, which have been further elevated by the pandemic. And I think we all have a base understanding, and I will attest that I am still learning myself about the racial history of our country, the racial history of this area. I moved out here in 2016 from Old City, Northern Liberties, Philadelphia, and was amongst the history that we had in that city for over 20 years, and having grown up on the edge of Philadelphia. And it wasn't until I moved out here to Chester County did I realize the significance of the history of slavery at the level that I have, the interaction and relationship between blacks and whites to further our efforts of freedom that we're still dealing with. And so as I looked at the calendar today, I thought about Father's Day, which is Sunday, and Juneteenth sitting side by side on the calendar. And as I think about my dad every day, and I think about him even more on Sunday, my dad fought in the Korean War for our country, and he earned not just one, but 2 Bronze Stars. Had he had lived 100 years before, he would have been a slave, torn apart from his family, our family. His ancestors, our ancestors, persevered long enough so that my father could serve his country and get an education. And yet, when he went to apply for a loan to open his office in West Philadelphia to serve the community that he was trained in at the University of Pennsylvania, at Howard University, at South Carolina State, he was denied that loan and told by that 28-year-old loan officer that a man like my father, a well-educated Black man, would never get a loan from him. And so when I think about Chester County, that has less than, I believe, 7% African American, meaning that as Black people, as we navigate racial attitudes towards us all day, every day, I think we are all in one of the most racially blessed places in this country. And here in Chester County, I think we all know we have the Underground Railroad, and I think known to have the largest number of stations in the nation. It's a place where Blacks and whites came together for the dream of a more equal world where we allied, coordinated, prayed, sweat, elated together to help those who believed that the paths on the Underground Railroad were the paths to freedom. On June 20th, 1862, which would be this Sunday, 6 Quakers from the Longwood Progressive Meeting for Friends, as some of you may know, based here in Chester County, met with President Abraham Lincoln in the White House with a congressional delegation that led them there to urge him for the freedom of the millions of enslaved men, women, and children. Those 6 individuals did not know what was going to be the result of their trip. But approximately 32 days later, as we know, President Lincoln issued his first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. And then on January 1st, as we know, his presidential order made the Emancipation Proclamation real. I feel proud to represent my Chester County history, this celebration, and I know that if we work together to elevate the knowledge and experiences here, we can offer all a chance to be reminded that Juneteenth was the beginning of a legacy of diversity, was a catalyst for a better society, a legacy of triumph over tragedy and oppression, a legacy of mutual trust, and work for a better future for all of our children. So thank you for the opportunity to speak. I told you that I work for a Baptist minister, so I might be over my time a little bit, but I hope that all of you will take advantage of what the partners have come together. And I think probably in the history of Chester County relative to this time, this is probably the most significant celebration that we've had. And as Connor, you and I talked before we talked, our opportunity and our challenge is to continue this work. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to this great celebration of the 27th Annual Town Tours and Village Walks program and Juneteenth, kicking off Juneteenth. I'm Brian O'Leary, the Executive Director of the Chester County Planning Commission. Really glad to be here in person and see you, and looking forward to doing the tour afterwards. Our history is a key element of who we are, and our town tours and our historic commissions and our municipalities who work on preserving our history are such critical, important elements of really keeping sense of place and community that we have here in Chester County. We have a county comprehensive plan called Landscapes Free, and historic preservation is a key element of this plan. It's adopted in 2018, and it has 6 goals. There isn't a transportation goal. Transportation is under something called Connect, but there is an Appreciate goal, a goal about historic preservation, one of our 6 goals. It just shows how important it is to the county. And the plan seeks to balance growth and preservation. And people think of preservation as open space. Let's keep as much open space as we can in Chester County. And by the way, I'm happy to say we have 144,000 acres of preserved open space permanently protected in Chester County. It's about 30% of the county's land area, and that is bigger than the cities of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh combined. But people think our character is the open space. It's not the open space. It's actually the open space plus the historic structures and buildings that we have here in Chester County laid over that. And so I think that's really a key part of who we are. The goal is being implemented at the Planning Commission in a variety of ways. One is that we do these town tours and village walks. We're increasing our historic preservation inventories, expanding interpretation and education, and we're preparing an adaptive reuse guide. There's a number of you in the audience who are involved in that. And we have a great advisory committee that is helping us with this adaptive reuse guide. And I want to emphasize the adaptive reuse guide because it is such an important element of preservation for us. If properties aren't reused, we don't find a way to reuse them, then they just deteriorate and eventually disappear. And so we're really working hard at finding ways our historic properties can be used. I'm not going to talk long here, so what I want to do now is actually pass the baton over to our new historic preservation coordinator, Dan Shahar-Krasnov. He's got excellent experience in St. Louis leading our historic preservation efforts. So, Dan.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dan Shahar-Krasnov, the Heritage Preservation Coordinator for Chester County. So excited to help kick off the town tours and village walks for the 27th year. Having just arrived in my position a month ago, I'm happy to report what you all already know. Chester County is beautiful and unique, characterized by historic town centers, crossroads, and bucolic countryside. This is a really wonderful place, and I'm honored to assist in the preservation of structures in the county. But there's much more here than visual appeal. The historic themes of the county, the American Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, including steel and iron, and the Quaker and agricultural heritage during the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries are themes of the American experience, not just of Chester County. This year, town tours eliminate another exciting element of our history, the journeying towards freedom. These tours spotlight the efforts of heroic African Americans and their white allies in the search for liberation and equality. William Still's work with the Underground Railroad is just such an example of that heroism that we'll hear about tonight. In the presentation and tours tonight, and in the coming nights, the wonderful old buildings of the county will come alive with stories of freedom seeking and the people who did that work. The tours are the result of hours and hours of work by preservation organizations and the civic leaders of the boroughs and townships in our county. Thank you to our hosts tonight, the Westchester Historical Commission and the Chester County History Center. The town tours would not take place without the significant support of the County Board of Commissioners, the Planning Commission, the Chester County History Center, the Chester County Preservation Network, and the Convention and Visitors Bureau, and of course, Voices Underground. Led by the History Center, these organizations are all fostering greater understanding through the Juneteenth Festival through July 3rd. Finally, I especially want to note that my predecessor, Karen Marshall, for bringing this project to fruition. Karen has enhanced these tours for over 14 years of service to the county, having only retired in April. Additionally, Kathleen Hood has done so much to organize the virtual tours, and Nancy Shields has organized tonight's hybrid event. Kathleen, Karen, and Nancy are integral to the success of the town tours. It is great to be here, and I hope you enjoy the presentation tonight and the town tour on Thursday nights through August 21st. Now I'd like to introduce the county commissioners who will welcome you. They are excited that the contributions of the men and women of Chester County to our history are highlighted in this year's town tours. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us this evening as we kick off the 27th year of the Town Tours and Village Walks. We have a wonderful program this year with both virtual and in-person options. The programs will highlight local historic sites and stories focused on the journey toward freedom and the places where those journeys are especially evident. This is truly a timely and timeless theme. I hope you enjoy this evening's program, where author Bill Kashatus will talk about William Still, a prominent figure in the Underground Railroad in our broader region, and in the Westchester Historical Commission will lead walks to explore Westchester sites and discuss one-time residents who are important in the journey toward freedom.
We are fortunate this year that not only do we have town tours to learn about our history and the struggle for civil rights, but we also have the Juneteenth Festival to honor all of those, past and present, who have worked together for freedom for all. The Juneteenth Festival is a weeks-long, multi-part commemoration of the continuing journey toward freedom that has been embedded in the country's heritage since the late 1700s. Through stories and songs, prayer and thanksgiving, gatherings and walks together, the festival seeks to continue the journey toward freedom today. The county and town tours is pleased to be part of the festival, along with Voices Underground, the Chester County Historic Preservation Network, and the Chester County History Center. More information on the full schedule of Juneteenth activities can be found at the Voices Underground website, and we urge you to engage with essential commemoration.
You will notice a change in this year's program as the county's longtime Heritage Preservation Coordinator, Karen Marshall, has retired. We congratulate Karen on her retirement and thank her for the work to get this year's program ready to go. We welcome Dan Shakar Krasnoff, our new Heritage Preservation Coordinator. Dan comes to Chester County with tremendous experience in historic preservation, and we're happy to have him on board as we get the 2021 town tours underway. As always, a special thank you to all the volunteers and the sites supporting the individual sessions this year, and to our co-sponsors of town tours and village walks, the Chester County History Center, the Chester County Historic Preservation Network, and the Chester County Conference and Visitors Bureau. This is truly a collaborative effort. To all of our attendees, please enjoy tonight's program and join us at the upcoming town tour programs and the wealth of activities that are taking place as part of the Juneteenth Festival.
Good evening. I'm Kathleen Hood, board member with the Chester County Historic Preservation Network. And it is an honor to be here tonight with this incredible celebration with both Juneteenth and the Chester County Town Tours and Village Walks. Chester County is a vibrant tapestry woven together artistically by people of many races, colors, creeds, religions, and national origins. One of the three original counties in Pennsylvania, Chester County has reveled in its rich history and cultural heritage by sponsoring the annual Town Tours and Village Walks program for the past 27 years. Through these programs, we are able to discover our shared past in order to inspire both our present and future. It is with great pleasure that we kick off the countywide Juneteenth celebrations, as well as the first in the 7-part 2021 Town Tours and Village Walks summer series, Journeying Toward Freedom, in which we will explore Chester County's far-reaching struggle to ensure freedom, liberty, and justice for all. Questions tonight will be taken both live at the History Center by Beverly Shepard and online by Suzanne Emmerich. If you are at the History Center, you'll be able to ask your questions there. If you are joining online, you may submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and then typing in your question. We will answer as many questions as time permits. And now it is my honor to introduce to you tonight's presenter, Bill Kashatus. William Kashatus is a historian, educator, and author. A Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Earlham College, he earned an MA in history at Brown University and a PhD in history education at the University of Pennsylvania. He currently teaches history at Luzerne County Community College in Northeastern Pennsylvania. He has also taught at Penn's Graduate School of Education in the History Department of Westchester University. While serving as Director of Educational Programs at the Chester County Historical Society, now the History Center, Bill curated the nationally recognized exhibit Just Over the Line, Chester County and the Underground Railroad. A prolific writer, Kashatus has authored more than 24 books, published more than 200 essays, and has appeared on National Public Radio and the Pennsylvania Cable Network, as well as many local television and radio stations. Please join us in extending a warm welcome to William Kashatus.
It's wonderful to be back as a Chester County, I would like to thank the team that put together the Juneteenth celebration. I think this is a wonderful program and very proud to be part of it, so thank you. 20-some years ago, when I was here at the Historical Society, I had the privilege to curate a multimedia exhibit on the Underground Railroad. It remains perhaps the greatest, most personally rewarding enterprise in which I have ever been involved. The story not only involves Chester County, but it involves Philadelphia and two individuals who I came to know. William Still, the free Black chairman of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society in Philadelphia, who ran that end of the Eastern Line, and Thomas Garrett, a white Quaker abolitionist from Wilmington, Delaware, who ran really the Chester County part of the Underground Railroad. A dear friend of mine, a consultant on the advisory board for that exhibit, James McGowan, Black historian, was also very enamored of William Still. And for better and worse, he talked me into doing a database of the hundreds of slaves that Still had mentioned in his 780-page book, The Underground Railroad. I agreed. I don't know why I agreed at the time. It was probably crazy to do so. But I began this project with him. And when we started, we wanted to do create a database and do a multivariate analysis of those, what ended up being 995 runaway slaves who passed through Chester County. And we wanted to create a profile of those runaways. In 2008, Jim passed away. The database was only 1/3 completed, so I was left with the rest of it. And finally, about 3 years ago, I completed the book. No one was interested after I did the multivariate analysis. No publisher was interested after I completed the multivariate analysis. They instead told me that I should write a biography of William Still. And I kept on saying, you don't understand. This book is the authentic source on the Underground Railroad. It is the first history written by an African American on the secret route to freedom. All the other books that we have are written primarily by white Quakers. I am a Quaker, but I must admit that my brethren have a tendency to breastfeed a little bit about their role on the Underground Railroad. And this also has a self-contained population. All the other statistical studies that have been done on the Underground Railroad are random populations. So what I found were a number of patterns that challenged the historiography on the Underground Railroad after I analyzed the database, and I will share them with you here tonight in the audio PowerPoint. And then afterwards, if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. But thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for your interest, and enjoy the PowerPoint.
Angel at Philadelphia, a multivariate analysis of William Still's Underground Railroad, 1853 to 1861. In August 1850, Peter Freedman, an ex-slave who had recently purchased his freedom, arrived at the office of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia. There he met William Still, a free black abolitionist and director of Philadelphia's General Vigilance Committee. Freedman explained that he was searching for his mother, from whom he had been separated in slavery some 40 years earlier. As Still listened to the man's story, he was struck by the similarities to his own mother's past. Charity Still was born, raised, and wed in slavery on Maryland's eastern shore. She and her husband, Levin, were the young parents of 4 small children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Levin purchased his own freedom, resettled in Burlington County, New Jersey, and became a farmer, hoping to save enough money to secure the manumission of his wife and their children, who remained in bondage. Charity and her 2 daughters rejoined Levin after a successful escape, but were forced to leave behind their 2 sons, 8-year-old Levin and 6-year-old Peter. But the similarities ended there. According to Freedman, he and his older brother were kidnapped from their mother, who he referred to as Sydney. Carried south, Levin Jr. died a slave in Alabama, but Peter earned the $500 necessary to purchase his own ransom from his owner, a Jewish merchant named Joseph Freedman. With no knowledge of the last names of his mother and father or where he was born, Peter set out to find his mother. His search took him to Philadelphia, where he planned to have notices read in the African American churches of the city in the hope that some of the older members might recall his mother's circumstances. Listening to Peter's tale, William couldn't help but notice the facial resemblance between Freedman and his own mother. I could see in the face of my newfound brother the likeness of my mother, he wrote of the moment he realized that Peter was the older brother he had never met. My feelings were unutterable, wrote Still. The reunion inspired William Still to assist fugitives who also longed to be reunited with their families. He and his wife Letitia George often hid runaways in their own home at 832 South Street. He also communicated with dozens of station masters and conductors. With their assistance, Still coordinated the movements of hundreds of fugitives along the eastern line of the Underground Railroad from Northern Virginia to Canada. Although his activities were in direct violation of the federal fugitive slave law of 1850, Still assisted nearly 1,000 slaves to freedom between 1853 and 1861. In the process, he recorded detailed notes on every one of the fugitives that came under his care. In 1872, he published those records in a 780-page book titled The Underground Railroad. It was his hope that the book would allow other African American families to find lost members who had been separated in slavery. For all these efforts, Still was given the endearing moniker Angel at Philadelphia. I first learned of William Still 16 years ago when I worked at Chester County Historical Society, located in what was once a hotbed of Underground Railroad activity. During that time, I curated a multimedia exhibit on the secret passage to freedom and still was a major part of that story. Although I had plans to write a biography of his life, I realized that it could not be done without a careful analysis of the runaways who came under his care. To my surprise, my dear friend, the late James McGowan, an authority on Still's friendship with the Quaker Underground Railroad agent Thomas Garrett, had already begun an extensive database of the runaways Still assisted to freedom. He invited my help in that effort. It was a daunting task, to say the least, a task I abandoned after Jim passed away in 2008 and I relocated to northeastern Pennsylvania to take a job at Luzerne County Community College. Fortunately, I was able to resurrect that ambition when LCC gave me the opportunity of a sabbatical in spring of 2015. I took that opportunity to comb through the 780 pages of Still's book and create a detailed database of the 995 fugitives he assisted to freedom. The database categorizes each slave by name, gender, age, skin color, and date of escape, among other factors. After creating the database, I completed a multivariate analysis to see if any patterns emerged and whether or not those patterns were consistent with the research others who had written about the Underground Railroad had found. Today, I will present the findings of that study. The critical questions I will address are: what was the Underground Railroad and how did it operate? What was William Still's role? What is unique about this statistical study? And how do the findings compare to the existing historiography on the Underground Railroad? The Underground Railroad was a pseudonym for the secret movement of black slaves escaping out of the South and into the free North. They were assisted by a loosely organized network of white and free black abolitionists. While the enterprise began sometime after 1780 with the Gradual Abolition Act in Pennsylvania, the Underground Railroad was most active between 1835 and 1861. Traffic along the illegal route increased significantly after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which greatly strengthened a similar 1793 law. The 1850 measure not only gave slaveholders the right to organize a posse to assist in capturing a runaway, but courts, federal marshals, and bystanders were obligated to assist in the recapture. Abolitionists adopted the vocabulary of the railroad to disguise their illegal activities. Accordingly, the term underground suggested a secret, and a railroad suggested a method of transportation. Those abolitionists who opened their homes to runaways were referred to as station masters, and their homes stations. Other abolitionists who guided fugitives between stations were called conductors. Stockholders played a less dangerous and less conspicuous role, but one that was extremely important. They provided the finances needed for bribes, transportation, food, and clothing. Vigilance committees, which existed in many northern cities, were the most structured vehicles of the Underground Railroad. In Philadelphia, Quakers established and supported the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, but working-class blacks served as the backbone of the Vigilance Committee. Free blacks sheltered and transported fugitives, as well as gathered and relayed crucial information to Still. Others kept watch for suspicious whites they observed in the hotels or boarding houses or on the streets of the city. Many of the Vigilance Committee members belonged to Mother Bethel, the city's oldest and largest African Methodist Episcopal Church, organized in 1794 by the Reverend Richard Allen, a former Delaware slave. Acting from a sense of personal obligation to their enslaved brethren, Philadelphia's free black community raised the bulk of the Vigilance Committee's operating funds from African American benevolent societies and AME church-affiliated auxiliaries. Their success is reflected in the hundreds of runaways they assisted, which has been estimated at 495 between December 1852 and February of 1857. The Underground Railroad had two major routes: the Western Line, which began in Kentucky, extended through Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and then into Michigan before entering Canada, where slavery was abolished in 1833. Cincinnati was the nerve center of this route, and Levi Coffin, a Quaker merchant, served as the principal coordinator. The Eastern Line originated in Virginia, extended through the border states of Maryland and Delaware into Pennsylvania, and then into New York or New England, and ended in Canada. Philadelphia was the nerve center of this eastern route. The thick blue lines you see on the map indicate the various routes fugitives took in their escape from the South. The thin orange lines indicate the loose network of Underground Railroad routes. William Still served as a station master, conductor, and stockholder of the Eastern Line. As chairman of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society's General Vigilance Committee, he raised funds, corresponded with station masters and conductors, and coordinated the movement of fugitives along this line of the Underground Railroad. Still stocked a veritable storehouse of food and clothing for runaways at his office at 31 North 5th Street, and aided in many daring escapes. Just as important, Still kept a meticulous record of the slaves he harbored. Between 1853 and 1861, Still personally interviewed the 995 runaways who came under his care. Traveling the eastern line of the Underground Railroad, these fugitives came from Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. Still recorded their names as well as their age, skin color, gender, and paid careful attention to family information such as number of siblings, names of parents, spouses, and children. He also recorded details about their bondage, including the owner's name, how they were treated, and their reason for running away. Just as important to Still were the details of their escape: point of origin, date of departure, mode of travel, reward for capture, whether they were armed, or if there was any physical violence during the route to freedom. Still compiled the information in a series of journals and kept them in his possession until 1859, when the papers of the radical abolitionist John Brown were seized by federal authorities after his unsuccessful attempt to lead a slave insurrection at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Still, fearing that his own records might be captured by a pro-slavery mob, hid them in a Philadelphia cemetery and kept significant or subsequent notes of his interviews on loose slips of paper. In 1872, he published the records in a 780-page book titled The Underground Railroad. The work is considered by historians to be the most authentic source on the secret route to freedom. Another 149 cases are contained in a separate Journal C, which was never published. Until the late 20th century, historians ignored William Still's book, as well as his anti-slavery activities. Instead, the white abolitionists who wrote early accounts of the Underground Railroad tended to emphasize their own heroics, omitting the contributions of others, most notably the free black community and the fugitives themselves. Often these accounts were further embellished and replicated in subsequent novels, plays, and in some cases, historical monographs. The result was an overemphasis on white abolitionist involvement, particularly among Quakers, and an oversimplification of a complex historical phenomenon that involved many religious groups, as well as free blacks and fugitives themselves. Not until the 1960s were the important roles of the fugitives themselves and the free black community recognized. Beginning in the late 1970s and continuing through the 1990s, public interest in the Underground Railroad was renewed by black historians who stressed the more aggressive role played by African Americans and their churches. Many of these interpretations were based on oral histories and local records that were previously ignored by scholars. Other historians, both black and white, focused on interracial cooperation. Still others examined newspaper advertisements, court records, and the wills and inventories of slave owners in order to determine a profile of the type of slave who sought freedom, their motives for doing so, as well as their ultimate destination. Since the 1960s, historians have increasingly relied on William Still's book in their interpretation of the Underground Railroad's Eastern Line, but none offered a careful statistical analysis of the nearly 1,000 slaves he assisted. That was my intention 15 years ago when McGowan and I began to create a database of those slaves. During my sabbatical, I completed and analyzed that database and recorded the findings. My study goes beyond the historiography of the Underground Railroad in several important ways. First, the study analyzes a self-contained body of work that is widely recognized by scholars as the most authentic record of the Underground Railroad. Second, unlike previous studies which investigate random populations, my study examines a controlled population, specifically runaways who began their trek largely in one of 3 states in the Upper South, Delaware, Maryland, or Virginia. Third, the study, when published, will offer historians an accessible and detailed database of 995 runaway slaves categorized by some 20 different fields, including name, age, gender, skin color, date of escape, place of origin, mode of transportation, and literacy. The database will serve as a valuable aid for other scholars by offering the opportunity to find new information and therefore a new perspective on runaway slaves. Fourth, my findings provide an important corrective to the existing historiography on the Underground Railroad in regard to the age, skin complexion, literacy, and method of escape used by fugitives. Finally, this study not only identifies the names of the fugitives who came under William Still's care during the period 1853 and 1861, but in some cases their owners and the agents who assisted them as well. The names are cross-referenced with the pages on which they appear in the 1970 reprint of Still's book or in Journal C. These references are especially useful since Still's book does not contain an index of the runaways he assisted. I believe that these contributions will make this study an extremely valuable reference work for scholars and general readers interested in the history and operation of the Underground Railroad, as well as those tracing African American ancestors. Let's begin with an examination of the age and gender of the runaways assisted by William Still. I discovered that the great majority were young men in their late teens and 20s. 85% of the runaways were between the ages of 17 and 32, and the average age was 25. Young men ran away in greater numbers because they resented not only the physical abuse they suffered at the hands of an overseer or master, but also having to work for another man and surrender the fruit of their labor. In addition, young men ran away in greater numbers because they were either unmarried or had not yet begun a family. Without family responsibilities, they were able to strike out on their own and begin a new life in freedom. They also had the physical stamina to endure the challenges of a journey to the north and could better defend themselves against slave hunters than females. While this pattern reinforces the historiography, I also found that the eastern line of the Underground Railroad had a more significant number of female escapes than was previously believed. The database reveals that of the 968 runaways whose gender is known, 237 or 24% were female, and 63 of those women demonstrated the courage and creativity to escape alone. Thus, while the number of independent female runaways was rare, it did happen. In regard to the value of a runaway, I found that the eastern line was consistent with the historiography in that the younger a fugitive, the higher he was valued. Of the 35 cases where the value of a slave was known, those worth between $1,600 and $2,000 each had an average age of 25. Those worth between $1,000 and $1,500 each had an average age of 26, and those worth less than $800 had an average age of 27. According to the historiography, however, the reward a fugitive commanded was based on 5% or less of his value. For example, a fugitive worth $1,600 in 1860 would bring a maximum reward of just $80 if he was captured. But I discovered that the reward offered for William Still's fugitives were much higher. Of the 73 runaways for which a reward was posted, 53 or 73% were valued at $100 to $500. If those estimates are calculated on the basis of the 5% rule, as the historiography maintains, these same runaways would be valued somewhere between $2,000 and $10,000 each. Such cash values are extremely high, even with the average age for the 53 runaways being just 23 years of age. Another important corrective to the historiography can be found in the comparison between individual and group escapes. While the majority of runaways were young single men who traveled alone so they could more easily avoid detection, a significant number of those individuals in my study escaped in groups. In fact, the majority of fugitives in this study escaped in groups that consisted of one or more families. Of the 995 fugitives in the database, 660 or 66% escaped in 173 groups of 2 or more members compared to the 336 or 34% who escaped on their own. This pattern is most likely due to the family composition of those groups and the belief that women and children would be successful only if they escaped in groups that were led by male runaways. Because the majority of fugitives ran away in groups, they tended to come from the same geographical region. The majority of the runaways in the database came from 3 states. Of the 943 runaways for which the state of origin is known, 476 or 51% came from Maryland, 297 or 32% came from Virginia, and 89 or 9% hailed from Delaware. The high incidence of fugitives from these 3 states was due to their proximity to Philadelphia and significant anti-slavery sentiment in the border states of Maryland and Delaware, and to the accessibility of water routes to the north in the case of Virginia. The correlation between skin complexion and literacy comprises another important finding in my study. According to this study, skin color was the foundation of a caste system in the South, both among white masters and slaves. The lighter a slave's complexion, the more favored he was by the master, and the more superior he was considered in the slave community. Take, for example, this individual who was a full-blooded African slave. Because of his extremely dark skin, he would be considered the most inferior by his master and relegated to the role of a field slave. On the other hand, this mulatto, who was probably the child of a white slave master and his black mistress, had lighter skin and would be given less arduous tasks, perhaps even serving as the master's coachman. Finally, this slave was nearly indistinguishable from a white woman. She was an octoroon, having only 1/8 African blood. She would be given the most favored role as a house servant. Skin complexion was also an important factor in identifying runaways. I found that most of the runaways in the database can be categorized as black. William Still described these fugitives as having superb black complexion, full black, very dark hue. Other lighter-skinned runaways were described by Still as chestnut, brown-hued, and light-skinned. Of the 390 fugitives whose complexion is known, 289 or 74% were black, compared to 101 or 26% runaways who were described as mulatto. While this pattern is consistent with the historiography, this study disproves the popular notion of a correlation between literacy and lighter complexion slaves. Of the 69 cases where literacy is known, 25 or 36% of the mulatto runaways were literate, and 21 or 30% of the black runaways were able to read and write, not an appreciable difference. Skin color was not known for the remaining 23 runaways who were identified as literate. However, the 6% difference in literacy rates between black and mulatto fugitives challenges the notion that light-complexioned slaves held an educational advantage over those with a darker hue. In fact, there were varying degrees of literacy among the fugitives who were assisted by William Still, and not all the mulattoes were as refined in their writing skill as some of the blacks. Thus, the difference between the literacy rates of light and dark-skinned runaways was so slight it is insignificant. I also found an important difference between the historiography and Still's runaways in terms of the means of escape. The means of escape was largely due to the opportunities available to a slave. Since water passage to Philadelphia and other northern destinations was more readily available along the Underground Railroad's eastern line than it was on the western line, fugitives from slave states like Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware were more likely to escape on boats, schooners, or steamships than to risk a more physically demanding journey over land. Predictably, one of the most common means of escape for fugitives on the Eastern Line was watercraft, specifically boat, schooner, skiff, or steamer. Of the 343 cases for which the means of escape is known, 152 or 44% of the fugitives escaped via watercraft, compared to those who escaped on foot, which was 146 or 43%, horse and carriage, which were 30 or 9%, or railroad, which was 10 or 3%. This finding offers an important corrective to the historiography, which stresses that regardless of the eastern or western line, the majority of slaves escaped overland and minimizes water transportation. Finally, the month of escape also presents an interesting pattern. Like the historiography, I found that November was the most popular month of escape for runaways. Of the 659 cases where the month is known, 89 or 14% escaped in November. October is the next highest month, with 74 or 11% of the escapes, and late October in particular. Thus, late autumn, with a total of 212 escapes, or 32% of the total, is when most slaves struck out for freedom. The absence of a slave was less noticeable after the autumn harvest than in the spring or the summer, when the demands of farming were greater and the fugitive could get a head start before his owner realized he was missing. In addition, the autumn afforded better traveling conditions than the winter, when the weather grew significantly colder and snow became a major obstacle. Having said that, I found that the overriding factor determining the month or season of escape were largely due to the opportunities available to a runaway slave. In the case of still fugitives, the summer was just as preferable as the autumn, because water passage to Philadelphia was more readily available along the eastern line of the Underground Railroad than in the west. Fugitives from Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware were more likely to escape on boats, schooners, and steamships, and took advantage of that opportunity whenever they could seize it, regardless of the season. Of the 152 cases where escape by watercraft is known, 28% of the fugitives fled during the summer, compared to 38 or 25% in the autumn. Thus, escape by watercraft was just as preferable, if not slightly more preferable, in the summer months for runaways on the eastern line of the Underground Railroad. Today, questions still remain about the effectiveness of the Underground Railroad. At the most liberal estimate, some 100,000 slaves of the 4 million in bondage in the South escaped on the illegal network between its creation in the 1780s and the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Considering that there were almost 4 million African Americans in bondage in the antebellum South, the enterprise benefited less than 3% of the slave population. William Still, who somehow managed to assist nearly 1,000 of those runaways, was probably not satisfied with those numbers. But he, like the agents who assisted him, understood something that seems to elude those who question their success. Specifically, they realized that as long as a single individual is deprived of their God-given liberty, then no American is ever truly free. By that standard, William Still and the success of the other Underground Railroad agents was immeasurable.
That presentation. I have one question for you. Would you describe your work on the history centers just over the line, Chester County, and the Underground Railroad exhibit, as well as the national recognition that resulted from developing this program?
Do you have an hour? Bev Shepard, who you'll meet later, had just completed an exhibit on the American Revolution before I was hired. And that was a tough act to follow. One of the things that we wanted to do to continue along that route was to make Chester County Historical Society more popular, more accessible to minority groups and the average Chester County, and it really hadn't been up to that period of time. And after talking with my colleagues, we felt that the Underground Railroad was a natural follow-up because Chester County was, of course, a hotbed of tension between pro-slavery and anti-slavery elements in the antebellum period. It took everybody here, and we were a very small staff, to pull together and do this exhibit. There were days when we wanted to kill each other because of the demands of the history, putting together the script, getting the images together from our collections, getting the documentation from the Chester County Archives, as well as our repository here. We did hire a number of people for an advisory board. James and Lois Horton, who were at that time in the late 1990s, the premier historians on the Underground Railroad, headed that advisory committee. Dear friend of mine, Jim McGowan, was on that committee. And actually a very sobering experience I had during that period of time. We had asked one Black historian who is very well known in this area to be an advisor, and he basically told me that as a white historian, I had no business doing an exhibit like that it is a Black story, and he didn't want any part of it. That was very sobering because I knew that there were other Black historians that felt that way. I was very fortunate. I think we were very fortunate, the Historical Society, to have the Hortons and McGowan on that advisory committee because they, like us, saw the Underground Railroad as American history, our history. To be sure, the Underground Railroad, the way we interpreted it, was the first great civil disobedience movement in our country's history, and it was integrated. And whether we like it or not, we are one people, and we have to move together, move forward as one people, despite the racial divide that exists in our country. The exhibit, I understand, set new visitation records. We put it together with a docket of programs, school group programs. We wrote a curriculum that was targeting middle school students because that particular age developmentally is very fascinated with secret keeping and also social justice issues. And it was successful. It was also a multimedia exhibit. And when the National Underground Railroad Freedom Committee in Cincinnati found out about us, and they were planning to put up their own museum on the banks of the Ohio River between the Bengals and the Cincinnati Reds sports complexes, they asked to come and monitor this. And as it ended up, they used a lot of the manipulatives and the same ideas that Ellen Enslow and Sanderson Caesar, who was the designer of the exhibit, put together. So a lot of that exhibit out there in Cincinnati right now mirrors what we had. And from there, the snowball just started rolling. The Journal of American History came and reviewed the exhibit and saw it not only as a wonderful exhibit of itself, but also what they called it a model for outreach to the community, because we also had a community advisory committee that came in and helped us tell that story. And one of the controversies that were going on at this period of time in the 1990s was, can you really call this history if it's not documented in writing? And one thing that I learned at that period of time, and I agree with you today, And as advocates of the critical race theory are pointing out, you cannot tell African-American history unless you tell oral history, because Africans and African-Americans traditionally have told their history in an oral format. So we honor that. The history that informed the exhibit was both documentary as well as oral. And as I said, it was without a doubt the most personally rewarding enterprise I've ever been involved in my professional life.
Well, congratulations on that. And that is it for the virtual questions, but Beverly Shepard's going to take over the live questions.
Thank you. I do need to tell you what a pleasure it is for me to be standing next to Bill right now, because we spent some time together when I was here in the past and before he came on board on the staff, and shared so much of the kind of desire to reach the whole of the county and to tell these really important stories. So thank you, Bill. All right, questions from this audience. I'm going to ask you to just speak up, and I will repeat the question, Bill, if necessary. Yes.
I kept track of that through Heinemann, who was the publisher of that history. And I do have to credit Suzanne Halstead and Barbara Jobe, who were members of the education department, because it was our work that we published together in that. And I kept track of it. That was done, I think, in 2002, maybe 2004. And I kept track of it through 2010. And at that period of time, there were some 70 school districts that were using that book across the country. I don't know where it's gone now.
Yes, Brian.
Were you able to track where the fugitives first arrived in Pennsylvania or other parts of the North, particularly Chester County? So where did they first arrive?
And the question is asked of where did fugitives first arrive in Chester County?
Thomas Garrett, who was the white Quaker station master in Wilmington, Delaware, had relatives. The Quaker network is incestuous, still is in a lot of ways. And Garrett had relatives, the Coxes, the Evanses, so that many of these people would start their track in Chester County in Kennett and then move out from there. Now, you have to remember Longwood Progressive Meeting was mentioned earlier. Longwood Progressive Meeting, yes, many of the people who belonged to that were schismatics from Kennett meeting, but that meeting was open to everybody. Anybody who had a radical reform cause. They weren't just Quakers. Many of them came from Chester County and opened their homes. But the entry point to Chester County, for the most part, was Kennett.
Others? Yes.
Sounds like Mr. Still's work was designed, hope was to reunite families or to get connections with their family history. Give a sense of how successful this work has been.
I'm going to repeat that question. William Still's work, as Bill was presenting it, seems to have had a really important role for bringing families back together. You know, what do we know about how successful that was?
As it turns out, William Still wrote and published that book for several reasons. That was his primary reason when he started to reunite families who were separated in slavery. And just a quick aside, but I think it's an important one. Many historians say that there were many slaves who remained in bondage because they didn't want to separate the family unit. That's not what I found. I found that particularly after 1850, the way to preserve the family unit was to escape and escape in groups. So that's, I think, another important corrective, at least as far as the Eastern Line is concerned. Back to your question. Yes, Still's original intention was to reunite families separated in slavery because that's what had happened to him and his brother. However, there were other reasons for that. And you have to understand what William Still did after the 13th Amendment. He became a civil rights pioneer, but unfortunately, he was part of the old guard, which believed in moral suasion. He had an integrated approach. He worked with white Quakers. He would present his case in newspaper editorials and the like. But there was a younger generation of civil rights pioneers led by Octavius Catto and the Pennsylvania Equal Rights League. These were young people, young men who fought in the Civil War in the US colored troops. They believed in direct confrontation, direct action. They did not want to work with whites unless they were politicians who could help further their cause, and Still knocked heads with them in trying to integrate Philadelphia streetcars and then trying to get the vote back for Philadelphia blacks. And some of the argument was pretty petty. I see William Still, after the Underground Railroad days, as a tragic hero, because if he was just able to step aside and work with these young reformers, I believe that he would have been the greatest reformer ever to come out of the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and one of the greatest reformers of all times. He wrote the Underground Railroad in the 1870s because his reputation among Philadelphia's Black community was on the downswing, and he wanted to resurrect his reputation. And I think the final thing that reason Still wrote that book is he wanted to disprove white notions of Black inferiority, intellectual inferiority. And I think he did that by writing this book. Back to your question, do I know how many families were reunited? I don't think there's any way of knowing. However, when Jim and I did this database, one of our intentions was at least to bring their descendants back together. If the families couldn't come back together, well, then maybe those African Americans who were interested in doing their genealogies and working at a place like this, there are a lot of people who are interested in their genealogy. You see it every day here. So if they get this book, and actually University of Notre Dame put the Excel database on their site. So, you know, you don't have to put it on your own database, but the book has in hard copy the names of every single one of those 995 slaves, where they came from, where they ended up, and so forth.
Yes, Jim.
Do you have any information on the recapture? Returning of slaves that had come to the Underground Railroad back to the South?
The question is, does Bill have information about recaptured slaves?
That's an excellent question. And I will tell you that Underground Railroad agents who wrote on this system were very hesitant to report those things because it ends right up back in the abolitionist newspapers, and then it discourages slaves from escaping. However, having said that, I know of at least 2 cases where there was recapture. There was recapture in the case of William Still's mother, because Sidney Still was her name, her original name. She tried to escape with her 4 children in the spring of 1805. She was recaptured. She escaped again in the winter of 1806, just with the 2 daughters. She made it. We know also, and I'm just talking about the Still family now, we know in the case of Peter Still, his brother, who paid his $5,000 for his own freedom. Well, he and William launched a plan to free Peter's wife, Vina, and their children from slavery. And Seth Conklin, a white Quaker, posed as a slave master and went down to Alabama, the cotton plantation, McKiernan Cotton Plantation, where they were slaves. And he made it with them as far as Vincennes, Indiana. They were captured. Conklin was killed. Vina and the children were put back into slavery. Peter had to go on a 4-year speaking circuit to raise the money to purchase their freedom, or I think it was $7,000. So there were cases of recapture, undoubtedly.
Yes.
I heard about William Still's book. I always heard about Robert Smedley, the doctor, who was a white doctor, who published the history of the Railroad in 1883. I wondered if was there any kind of connection? Was his book better known because he was white? And this is Robert Smedley, the Smedley book.
Very familiar with it, yes.
Yeah, let me just, the Smedley book on the history of the Underground Railroad is well known, I think, in this area too. And this is kind of a comparison of between the William Still's book and Smedley's.
There were 2 Underground Railroad accounts that were written in the late 19th century by whites. One was by Wilbur Siebert, which covers the entire Underground Railroad, both east and western lines. And then there was Smedley, which covers Chester, Lancaster, many places on the eastern line. I will say that Smedley is prone to exaggeration. There are a lot of things he takes at face value. Some of the things are based on local mythology, but he was pretty accurate in identifying the people who were station masters and conductors on the line. And in fact, the lithographs that are in Smedley's book were replicated in Still's book. So yes, these 2 books, Siebert and Smedley, preceded Still's book. And yes, I think because they were whites and they had a hand in the Underground Railroad, their works were much better known. But as I said, that's what makes Still so exceptional, because his was really the first account written by a black, he is called the first black historian, and he was there. He aided these 995 slaves. So he interviewed them, he helped them, and that's why it's called the most authentic work.
I think we're going to have to wrap up now in terms of questions. I do want to make one statement. Bill has talked about a couple of the things that appeared in that exhibit some time ago, and a few of those things are also, you can find in our Becoming Chester County exhibit in the area that talks about the Underground Railroad. So they have a continuing life. Let me turn this back to Suzanne.
Thank you, Beverly. We hope that you enjoyed our Chester County Juneteenth and 2021 Town Tours and Virtual Walk Summer Series, Journeying Towards Freedom kickoff. Our special thanks to presenter Bill Kashatus, the Chester County Commissioners, the Chester County History Center, the Chester County Planning Commission, the Chester County Historic Preservation Network, and all of you for making this program possible. Please join us next Thursday, June 24th, when we feature Ken Johnston and the Kennett Square Heritage Center for the incredible story, Journey in the Footsteps of Harriet Tubman. For those of you live at the History Center, please stay for just a moment while Beverly Shepard shares directions on exit and the live walking tours. Thanks again for tuning in tonight. Have a fabulous summer, and we hope to see you again for more 2021 Town Tours and Village Walk programs. Good night.